Now, when people ask me, what is my spiritual path? And I say, tea. And they look at me with this perplexed look. Tea? How can tea be a spiritual path? Well, it actually is. The drinking of tea. In ancient times, in China, the Zen Buddhists said Zen and tea, one flavor, meaning you can't separate Zen from tea.
Namaste. You're listening to the Savannah Podcast. Join us on an exploration of Eastern spirituality, yoga philosophy, and conscious living for the new age. This podcast is a production of SavannahSpirit.com, where you can find a large selection of Om and yoga clothing, spiritual jewelry, and unique fair trade gifts from the Far East. Now here's your host, Ashton Subbo.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Savannah Podcast. I am Ashton Subbo, your host. Today's episode is all about tea and the tea ceremony. We're very lucky to have our guest on the show, Ganga. He is a practitioner of Cha Tao, which is the way of tea. We're happy to have him on the show today. Ganga, welcome. Nice to have you.
Thank you, Ashton. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, really curious, how did you come to find tea and develop a love for tea that you have?
Well, like most of us, I grew up with tea in my home, but back then it was more like Lipton or Constant Comment. It wasn't until later in my life when I was living in India. My wife Tara and I lived in India for 7 years, and for 4 of those years we were living in an ashram. And you may know that even if you have a visa that it's 10 years long, you have to leave India every 6 months. So we would go to Thailand, and specifically to the island of Koh Samui, and we would give spiritual classes at a spa on Koh Samui. There was a German man named Sanbao who performed the Chinese tea ceremony twice a week on a veranda overlooking the Sea of Thailand. And it was a beautiful experience. This was our first introduction to the tea ceremony. It was a very social thing. People would sit at a long wood table, people from all over the world, and get to know each other. There's a famous Chinese saying, good tea makes good friends. And that's what it was all about, getting to know people. And Sanbao performed the tea ceremony for free. There was no charge. But if you wanted, you could buy a teapot or some tea from Sanbao, which we did. And we took the teapot back to India. And at that point, tea was not a big part of our life. Maybe once a week, we would brew a pot of tea. And this went on for several years. And then in 2012, my wife and I decided to do a world tour, go all the way around the world teaching. And in the beginning of that tour, we went to Taipei, Taiwan. And we knew that Taiwan was probably the center of tea culture for the whole planet. And when we got to Taipei, we emailed Sanbao back in Thailand and asked him, could he recommend a really good tea house? And he said, oh, if you're in Taiwan, you have to meet Wude, W-U-D-E, Wude. He is the man to meet in Taiwan if you want to learn about tea. So we emailed him, and he invited us to his nonprofit tea center about an hour and a half south of Taipei. And when we got there, it was like heaven on earth. It was just fantastic. We loved him. We loved all the people there. The place was beautiful. And Wude actually opened up for us the inner spiritual dimension of tea that we were completely unaware of. Up until that point, to us, tea was just a beverage that we drank occasionally. But what Wude did is he really explained to us the ancient spiritual connection between tea and meditation, and specifically Zen Buddhism. So that was a major pivotal moment for us. And after that, tea has actually just grown and grown in importance in our life. And now I would actually have to say tea is my spiritual path. Now, when people ask me what is my spiritual path, they're usually expecting I'll say something like Kundalini Yoga, Kriya Yoga, whatever. And I say, tea. And they look at me with this perplexed look. Tea? How can tea be a spiritual path? Well, it actually is. The drinking of tea. In ancient times, in China, the Zen Buddhists said Zen and tea, one flavor, meaning you can't separate Zen from tea. The early Buddhists discovered that if they drank tea before they meditated, their meditation was clearer, their mind was clearer, and they had a better meditation. And so throughout the ages, there has been this close, very close relationship between tea and Zen. We can talk more about that. As history went on, tea grew in importance throughout not only China, but the entire world.
Yeah, when we were talking about some of the history of tea when we were chatting in our pre-conversation yesterday, I am kind of curious as well. Why do you think that tea is such an important part of so many cultures across the planet?
Well, that's interesting because now you could probably go to any country in the world and tea is there, right? Mm-hmm. But it wasn't always the case. Tea was discovered in southwestern China, specifically Yunnan province, in the year 2737. The legend is that Shennong, who was considered the founder of Chinese medicine, that Shennong was about to drink some hot water in a bowl, and a leaf from a tea tree fell into that bowl, and he drank it and felt invigorated, and thereby discovered tea. Now that is a legend, and who knows if it's true or not, but it definitely is true that tea was first discovered as a wild tree, not cultivated, growing in the forest in southwestern China, Yunnan province, around 2737. Now, back then, tea was used by shamans as medicine.
As well, I think you just used a Buddhist date. Do you know what the date in the sort of Roman Common Era time is?
No, I don't know how to translate that.
Okay.
2737, I guess they say BCE, don't they?
Oh, okay, so BCE. Okay, so way, way back.
Oh, yeah.
We're not talking Buddhist times. Okay, I got, all right. All right.
And so originally, tea was used by shamans as medicine. Mm-hmm. And tea has tremendous benefits, health-wise. Then tea really grew in importance in China during the Tang Dynasty. That's called the Classic Age of Tea. That would be 1618 to 907, the Tang Dynasty. Tea spread through China. And in those times, the Buddhists would actually build their monasteries. The first Zen monasteries in China were built in places where they could grow tea because tea was so important to them. And then in a later time, there was a master named Lu Yu. And he lived from 733 to 804. And he wrote a book called the Cha Ching, the Classic of Tea. It was a treatise called the Classic of Tea. And this is of great importance because what Lu Yu did is he explained everything about where to find tea, how to gather it, how to process it, what the health benefits of it were. And his book, The Classic of Tea, resulted in a flowering of tea in China throughout the entire country. Then in the Sung Dynasty, 960 to 1280, this is called the Romantic Age of Tea, where tea had become so popular throughout China, especially amongst the nobility and the intelligentsia and the artistic people that there was a flowering of culture, tea poetry, tea art, tea paintings. Back at that time, if you were a Zen master, you were a tea master. And if you were a tea master, you were a Zen master. All Zen masters were also tea masters. And so that is the Sung Dynasty period. Now, at that point, tea was in China and had spread throughout all of China. But what we have to realize is it hadn't come to the rest of the world. There was a time when there was no tea in Japan. That's hard to imagine, because now you just cannot imagine going to Japan and not having tea. But there was no tea, zero tea in Japan. The Emperor of Japan regarded China as a much more highly developed civilization. And that was true. At that point, China was the most highly developed civilization in the entire world. And the Emperor of Japan sent envoys to China to bring back all of the advancements of Chinese society. And one of the things he did was send Buddhist priests, the first Buddhist priest in Japan, to study at the Zen monasteries in China. And one of those Japanese Buddhist priests named Saicho, Saicho, when he was about to come back to Japan from studying Buddhism in China, the abbot of the monastery said, if you're going to take Buddhism back to your country, you have to take tea with it. And he gave him plants and seeds. And that's how tea came to Japan. And then, of course, it spread through Japanese society. The samurai were very big on the tea ceremony. And the Japanese developed the tea ceremony into a high art of refinement.
Well, and it's similar to kind of what you're doing now yourself, of bringing tea and the tea ceremony back to the Western world. You had mentioned earlier in one of this treatise on tea about some of the health benefits. What are some of the health benefits of tea?
Well, as you probably know, one of the greatest benefits is that it is a stimulant without the edginess of coffee. Sometimes if you drink a lot of coffee, you feel edgy and there's a harshness to it. And tea doesn't have that. There are benefits to digestion, especially with pu'er tea. Pu'er tea is the tea that comes from Yunnan province. It's compressed into a cake. And then you break pieces off, put them in a pot, and add hot water. Pu'er tea is extremely beneficial to digestion. Also, tea detoxifies. It's a great detoxification agent to purify the body of toxins. There's so many benefits. We could talk for an hour about the health benefits of tea.
Nice. Well, I know, like I play a lot around with supplementation and stuff, and L-theanine, which is one of the ingredients in green tea that gives you that mental clarity without the jitteriness of caffeine, is something that I take regularly, that I really enjoy as well. Again, I drink tea, not to the extent that you are. I'm probably a little bit more on that social side. I have friends come over like, I'll offer some tea, and we sit down. So let's get this into the tea ceremony now. What does the tea ceremony teach us?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm really glad you asked it. There are, to our mind, there are two kinds of tea ceremony. There's the Japanese tea ceremony and the Chinese tea ceremony. The Japanese tea ceremony is extremely formal, and I actually studied it when I lived in Chicago many, many years ago. I was a much younger man at that point, and I met a tea master from Japan. Her name was Ika Nakashima. She began studying the tea ceremony when she was 5 years old. She was also an ikebana master, flower arranging. She was considered a national treasure. And so I studied Japanese tea ceremony, and it's incredibly beautiful. I love it. But it is highly formal and with very specific movements. every time you place a cup or pick up a teapot, you turn it a certain degree of rotation. And so even though I appreciate the Japanese tea ceremony, when I discovered the Chinese tea ceremony, it fit more into my way of living. It was more informal and casual.
Is there a reason behind the precision of that other than just the practice of awareness? Is it representative of the sort of microcosm and macrocosm, or is there other symbolism within that, or is it more like, well, can you be so attuned and present that you know exactly where you're putting everything? Like, where does that come out of?
Well, I think it really comes out of a different in the temperament or personality of the Japanese versus the Chinese. As you know, the Japanese society is highly structured, and Chinese is much more casual. Actually, the Chinese temperament is more like Americans. I've been to China 10 times, and I find that the Chinese are more like Americans than the Japanese. They're very informal and casual, whereas Japanese society is very, I could say uptight. I don't mean to look down on Japanese society, but it is extremely
very formal,
with set, very defined roles in society. But that doesn't, I'm not trying to say there that the Japanese tea ceremony is in any way inferior to the Chinese tea ceremony. One thing that happened, both in China and in Japan, as the nobility and the aristocracy adopted the tea ceremony to the extent that they did, and it became the rage, tea. I mean, everyone had tea sets. And the wealthy people began to make very, very elegant tea sets, teapots that were, very expensive. And the Japanese did this too, not only in China. And then there was a reaction against that. Many of the Zen masters felt that it was being turned into something that was too elegant. And they reacted against that by going back to using found objects in their teaware. For instance, a Zen master might find an old weathered piece of wood in a junk pile and use that as his tea tray, rather than spending some exorbitant amount of money on a very elegant tea tray. So they reacted against that tendency and brought the tea ceremony back to more simplicity and naturalness, which is something that we really like a lot. Now, one thing that happened in our life is that we started off just with one small teapot and one bag of tea. And over years, we accumulated more and more teaware. As we would travel throughout Asia to China or Thailand or Taiwan, we would see a nice teapot or some other teaware, and we began to acquire more and more. People come to our home now to have tea. 7 days a week, Tara and I offer tea for free in our home. It's our way. It's our path. It's our seva. To us, it's not a business. We have never in our life charged a penny for tea. It's a gift. It's not just sharing tea. It's a gift of love. Because now you won't really read this in many books on tea. You will read in books on tea that tea ceremony is a sharing of refinement, of beauty, and of respect. Many of the things you do in the tea ceremony, like the washing of the bowls with water before you serve the tea, that's both practical to wash the bowls, but it's also a gesture of respect to your guest, that you care so much about them that you'll make sure everything is clean before you serve them tea. So the tea ceremony is a sharing of refinement, of beauty, of good tea, and of respect. You won't read very often. I've never read it in a book, but I believe that really the tea ceremony is a sharing of love. You're sharing love. You see, Zen has been called a fast path to enlightenment. Why? Because it's a mind-to-mind transmission. A mind-to-mind transmission. There's an old expression in Zen. It's called the lighting of the lamp. You have one lamp that's lit, and you have another lamp that's not lit. And the two come in contact, and the one that's not lit is now lit. A Zen master is able to actually transmit their enlightened mind to the student. It's called the transmission of the lamp. So when a Zen master is serving tea, and pretty much you could go to any Buddhist temple or monastery in the world, and if you had a meeting with the abbot and you went into his office or chamber, the first thing he would do would be offer you tea. It's just done everywhere. The Zen master, when they're pouring tea, they're pouring bodhicitta. They're pouring loving kindness. The thing that motivates their entire life is bodhicitta, loving kindness. And so when they're pouring tea, they're actually pouring loving kindness into that cup. And what could be more intimate an experience than to actually take that loving kindness and ingest it into your body? So ultimately, that's how I view the tea ceremony. When people come to our home, we're not just sitting down to have a social beverage. Whether I tell the people or not, what I'm doing is I'm pouring loving kindness into that cup for them to ingest.
That's beautiful. Now, you're obviously extremely passionate about tea. It comes out of you and everything that you say. And I know people that are listening to the podcast can't see what we're seeing, but we've got this beautiful scene of you surrounded by your tools of tea, and it's a beautiful thing to see. And this might be an unfair question, like asking a parent which is their favorite child, but do you have a favorite tea?
This brings up a very interesting topic. There are so many kinds of tea. Tea from China, oolong tea, pu'er tea, tea from Taiwan, tea from Japan, matcha tea from Japan, tea from India, tea from Nepal, Tibet, tea from all over the world, practically. So when you really get into tea, when you take it on as it could be a hobby. It's a wonderful hobby, actually. We took it on as actually our spiritual path. But when you get into tea, you find that there's so much to explore. It's wonderful. It's a wonderful, huge universe of tea. So there are all the different kinds of tea that you can explore. There's all the different kinds of teaware, tea pots, tea cups, from all over the world. There's actually a city in Taiwan called Inga, where practically everything that is sold in that town has to do with tea. You can go from one tea shop to another. They sell different kinds of tea, different kinds of tea pots, tea cups, tea trays, tea implements. You can spend an entire day just going from store to store. So then, in addition to all that, there's the art of tea. I loved reading tea poetry by the Zen masters. Many of these Zen masters, who were tea masters also, composed beautiful poems about tea. And then there's tea art, paintings, beautiful paintings from China, Japan, Korea about tea. So it's a rich, rich universe to explore. And, you can never grow tired of it. Now, there is one thing that I really want to be sure to convey to your listeners, and that has to do with the deepest, most dimension of tea. Tea brings us into harmony with nature. And when you're drinking tea, especially if it comes from old growth, wild tea trees, and you can acquire tea from Western China, from Yunnan province, that comes from wild tea trees, not cultivated, wild. When you're drinking that tea, those trees have roots that go over 100 feet into the earth. Can you imagine that? 100 feet deep are the roots of those trees. Many of those trees are over 1,000 years old. And so those roots are actually drawing up from the earth trace elements that normally we wouldn't get. But even more than that, those trees have been absorbing for 1,000 years or more sunlight, moonlight, starlight, and cosmic energy. And so when you drink that tea, you're ingesting within you that sunlight, moonlight, starlight, and cosmic energy that has been stored by that plant for over 1,000 years. And that is a beautiful thing.
Super powerful. Now, like any good parent, you did a great job of not really saying which was your favorite. So we'll let you get away with that one. But you did.
The two kinds of tea that I love the most are oolong and pu'er. I love very old pu'er. Pu'er is aged like fine wine or cheese. There's a man in Santa Cruz. His name is David, and he has a wonderful tea shop. It's actually our favorite tea house in North America. It's called Hidden Peak. And he has 40 tons of pu'er.
Wow.
40 tons. There are people in China that will invest $1 million in pu'er tea, and then they'll store it so that it ages and it appreciates like gold.
Wow.
Over 10, 20, 30, 40 years. Not too long ago, another tea master in California gifted us some 1970 pu'er, and that was the finest pu'er I've ever had. So pu'er is something that there are connoisseurs in China that will only drink pu'er. For that matter, there are connoisseurs of tea in America that will only drink pu'er. But then the other type of tea that I love is high mountain oolong. And this comes from Taiwan, and it's grown in the high mountains of Taiwan. And for me, that is another specialty. And then another kind of tea would be matcha, and that comes
Which is the powdered tea, is that correct?
from Japan. And that's whisked. You have a bamboo whisk, and you place it in a bowl, you add water, you add the powder, and then you add the water, and then you whisk it. And that is another beautiful tea.
So for someone that is new to tea, or perhaps they've got a tea that they like or it's something that they enjoy, but they are interested in developing it more as a spiritual practice, perhaps just getting into it in a much more purposeful way, where do they start? What do they do? Like, what are some steps that they can take to actually get more involved and more into tea and the tea ceremony specifically?
Right. The first thing to do is to get a teapot. And it can be just a simple, rather inexpensive clay pot. You can usually find them for as little as $35, $45. A small clay pot and a few cups. And you shouldn't be intimidated that, this is something that is going to require a big investment and the acquisition of a lot of different teaware. Start out simply, just with a teapot and a few cups. And then what I recommend is to begin every morning before you meditate. If meditation is part of your life, you can include tea by drinking tea before you meditate. Sit down and in silence drink 3 cups of tea.
Is there a reason behind the 3 cups as opposed to 2 or 4?
Uh, 3 is a good number. And
Indeed.
also, it'll take less time than if you drink 4 or 5 cups of tea.
And then you'd have to break up your meditation because you got to go pee because you're drinking too much tea. So perfect. Okay.
3 is fine. 3 is a fine number. Have 3 cups of tea, or if you drink bowl tea, 3 bowls of tea, before you meditate. And do it in silence. Make it a ritual. Make it a time that you're actually practicing mindfulness. We have an expression, tea plus mindfulness equals meditation. It's a good formula. It's simple to remember. Tea plus mindfulness equals meditation. So this is what the Zen masters are doing when they drink tea. They're not just drinking tea like we would pull into a gas station and go in and get a Snapple and chug it down. No, they're practicing something with mindfulness. They're pouring the tea in silence, not talking. Drinking that tea, being present in the here and now, without thoughts about yesterday, without thoughts about tomorrow, just being present here and now. And then the drinking of tea becomes meditation. And this is a great way to start out your day. Then meditate, whatever way you meditate. Doesn't have to be Zen meditation. It could be Kriya Yoga. It could be transcendental meditation. It could be any kind of meditation that you feel an affinity to. But that meditation will be better because your mind will be more alert, but you'll also be calm. Calm and alert.
Wonderful. Well, it's a perfect thing. And anytime that you're creating a ritual where you're starting your day off, it really sets up the rest of the day to fall into place. So I love the option of including tea as part of any ritual that anyone already has. Where can we find out more about you, Ganga? You always have such a passion for this. Where can we find out some more information about you? I know that you do, even though we talked before that you're not offering classes in this moment, but you do, and you have toured a lot and offered classes all around. Where can we find out more about the things that you're doing?
Well, right now, Tara, my wife, and I have stopped touring and teaching. For many, many years, we toured America and Asia teaching, and we gave a workshop called Secrets of the Siddhas, Health, Longevity, and Enlightenment. And we've given that presentation free because we never charge for our spiritual teaching. We've given that over 600 times throughout America and Asia. And then last year, we decided to put touring and teaching on hold so that we can write some books. So right now we're writing 4 books. One book is on Chinese herbs, Chinese tonic herbs. And it's specifically about the herbs that Buddhist and Taoist sages used to develop health, longevity, and enlightenment. And then another book that we're writing is on Cha Tao, the way of tea. And we're writing 2 more books. So right now we're kind of in a retreat mode, just living in Mount Shasta, California, a beautiful place, which, by the way, has water that you cannot beat anywhere in the United States, direct from the glaciers on top of Mount Shasta. It's one of the reasons we moved here, because water is the most important ingredient in tea. They say if you have great tea, but bad water, you don't have good tea. But if you have good tea and excellent water, you have good tea. So we moved here because of the water that comes directly from the top of Mount Shasta. So right now we're not traveling and teaching, although if people are interested in inviting us to come give one of our presentations, we are certainly open to doing that. And
how can people contact you that way? Yeah,
they can contact us by emailing us at my email is Ganga Nath, GANGANATH 108 @gmail.com. ganganath108@gmail.com. And then we also have several websites and several blogs. One of our websites is emptycloudzen.com. emptycloudzen.com. So people can go to that website and they can.
And will that have some links to your other sites as well on there, and the other things, and email and all that information as well?
Well, that particular website is very Zen oriented, but it has an entire section on tea, and they can email us from there. Yeah.
Perfect. Well, wonderful. I really appreciate you coming on the show today, Ganga, and sharing your love and passion of tea. I think our listeners got a lot of great information, as well as some things they can do to get into tea themselves. So I hope our listeners go out and try some tea. Maybe they're even drinking some tea while they're listening to the show.
I hope.
Yeah.
And one thing I would add is that any of your listeners are invited to come drink tea with us at our home in Mount Shasta. No matter where they live, if they're on the West Coast, so obviously it'll be a lot easier, but if they live anywhere from Seattle to San Diego, a lot of people travel up and down Route 5 in California, and Mount Shasta is right on Route 5. So your listeners are always invited to come and drink tea with us. We love to have people drop by, and as the saying goes, good tea makes good friends.
Well, that's beautiful. Well, thank you so much for being on the show, Ganga. You might be getting a lot of emails about people want to stop by and drinking some tea, which I'm sure sounds like that you would love. So I hope some people do take you up on that. Appreciate your time, appreciate your passion. For all the listeners out there, thank you so much for listening today. I hope you've enjoyed. I hope you've learned a lot. Thank you so much for listening. Namaste. Hey everybody, thanks for listening to the show today. Please go over to iTunes, write a review, let us know what you think. It helps us in creating new content for all of you. It also helps new listeners get a sense of what to expect from the show. We really appreciate your feedback. Thanks again for listening. Namaste.
You've been listening to the Savannah Podcast. To find out more about Savannah, go to savannahspirit.com or follow Savannah on Facebook at facebook.com/Savannah Spirit. For daily inspiration, check out our blog at savannaeast.com. Be sure to join us next week for a new episode, and thank you for listening to the Savannah Podcast.